For 30 years, no one in Copper Falls ever paid Dr. Henry Morrison a single cent for medical care. What his final patient whispered on her deathbed would reveal a secret so devastating that it changed how an entire town remembered the man they thought they knew. Hit that subscribe button, because this story will shatter everything you believe about forgiveness and redemption. The year was 1887, and Copper Falls, Montana, was a town where death came as easily as the mountain wind. Silver mines claimed men's lungs, childbirth took mothers, and winter fever swept through cabins like wildfire consuming dry timber. In this harsh frontier settlement where most folks barely scraped together enough coins for food, medical care should have been a luxury only the wealthy could afford. Yet for 3 decades, Dr. Henry Morrison had never charged a single patient, never turned away a sick child, never demanded payment from families who had nothing but prayers to offer. The townspeople whispered that he was either a saint or a fool, but none questioned the miracle of free healing in a world that made everything cost blood, sweat, or gold. Dr. Henry Morrison was 58 years old, with silver hair and gentle hands that had delivered half the babies in Copper Falls and closed the eyes of their grandparents. He'd arrived in town 30 years earlier with nothing but a medical bag and a haunted expression that never quite left his pale blue eyes. The people loved him for his skill and kindness, but they'd learned not to ask about his past. Questions about family or his life before Montana would cause him to grow quiet and distant, his hands trembling slightly as he cleaned his instruments with obsessive precision. He lived alone above his clinic, emerging only to tend the sick, refusing all social invitations and keeping his personal life locked away like a shameful secret. The only hint of his inner torment was the way he'd sometimes pause while treating patients, staring at his hands as if seeing blood that others couldn't see. On a bitter February morning, Martha Clearwater was carried into Dr. Morrison's clinic, her body broken from a mining accident that should have killed her instantly. She was conscious but fading fast, her eyes focusing on the doctor with an intensity that made him step back from her bedside. "I know you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the Montana wind howling through the clinic walls. "I know why you came here. I know what you did back in Philadelphia." Dr. Morrison's face went white as mountain snow, his hands freezing in midair as he reached for his instruments. For 30 years he'd successfully buried his past beneath acts of healing and charity, but Martha Clearwater's dying words threatened to unearth secrets that could destroy not only his reputation, but his very soul. As she gripped his wrist with surprising strength, Morrison realized that his final patient might also be his final judgment. Dr. Morrison's hands shook as he tried to examine Martha's injuries, but her eyes never left his face. "Don't you recognize me, Henry?" Martha Clearwater now, but I was Martha Kellison then. Philadelphia, 1857. The smell of carbolic acid and impending death filled the small clinic, mixing with the scent of fear sweat that had begun to bead on Morrison's forehead. He could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, drowning out the sound of Martha's labored breathing and the wind rattling the clinic windows. "I don't know what you're talking about," Morrison whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. His medical instruments felt foreign in his trembling hands, 30 years of steady healing suddenly reduced to the fumbling of a man confronting his worst nightmare. Martha's smile was sad but knowing, the expression of someone who'd carried a secret for decades and finally found the right moment to speak it aloud. The lamplight flickered across her face, casting shadows that seemed to age her features, transforming her from a dying patient into an avenging angel. Martha's breathing grew more shallow, but her grip on his wrist remained iron-strong. "You remember the Kellison family, don't you? Irish immigrants, living in the tenements? My little brother Timothy, just 8 years old, burning up with fever." Morrison's face went ashen as memories he'd spent 30 years burying began to claw their way to the surface. The sound of sleet against the clinic windows seemed to echo the rain that had pounded Philadelphia's cobblestones on that terrible night when everything changed. "Please," Morrison begged, his voice breaking like a young man's rather than the steady tone of Copper Falls' most respected citizen. But Martha Clearwater was dying, and the dead have no mercy for the living. She'd waited 30 years for this moment, and no amount of pleading would stop her from speaking the truth that had followed Henry Morrison across half a continent. As her eyes began to glaze with approaching death, Morrison realized that his reckoning had finally arrived, carried on the lips of a woman whose family he'd destroyed 3 decades ago. "You were young then," Martha continued, her voice growing fainter but her words cutting deeper than any scalpel. "Just started your practice, full of ambition and pride. When my mother brought Timothy to your fancy office, you took one look at our clothes and told us you didn't treat charity cases." The memory hit Morrison like a physical blow, forcing him to grip the edge of the examination table to keep from falling. The sound of Martha's voice seemed to merge with echoes from the past, a desperate Irish mother's pleas, a child's fevered cries, and his own cold, arrogant dismissal. Outside, the Montana wind howled like the voices of the damned, but inside the clinic, time seemed frozen in a moment of terrible revelation. Morrison could smell the poverty that had clung to the Kellison family like smoke, could see his younger self in his pristine Philadelphia office, turning away a dying child because the family couldn't afford his fees. "Timothy died that night," Martha whispered, each word a nail in Morrison's coffin of guilt. "In our freezing tenement, crying for help that never came. My mother held him until dawn, whispering prayers in Gaelic that God didn't seem to hear." Morrison's legs gave out, and he collapsed into the chair beside Martha's bed, his face buried in his hands. The weight of 30 years of penance suddenly made sense. Every free treatment, every midnight house call, every act of charity had been an attempt to atone for the 8-year-old boy whose life he'd held in his hands and chosen to let slip away. The sound of his own sobbing filled the clinic, mingling with Martha's increasingly labored breathing as she used her final moments to deliver the judgment he'd been running from since 1857. "I've watched you for months," Martha said, her voice barely a whisper now. "Moved here from Colorado just to see if the stories were true. To see if Henry Morrison, the saint of Copper Falls, was really Henry Blackwell, the doctor who let my baby brother die." The false name hit Morrison like a branding iron. Henry Blackwell, the man he'd been before guilt and grief transformed him into someone worthy of redemption. But as Martha's eyes began to close for the final time, Morrison realized that his true identity was about to die with her, and he had no idea whether that meant salvation or damnation. As Martha's breathing grew increasingly shallow, the clinic door burst open, bringing with it a gust of frigid air and 3 of Copper Falls' most prominent citizens. Mayor Jackson, Sheriff Torres, and Reverend Mitchell had come to check on the accident victim, but they found their beloved doctor crumpled beside the bed, weeping like a broken man. "Doc Morrison, what's wrong?" Mayor Jackson asked, his voice filled with concern for the man who'd delivered his own children and tended his wife through countless illnesses. The smell of snow and horses followed them inside, mixing with the clinical odors to create an atmosphere of impending crisis. Morrison tried to compose himself, but 30 years of buried guilt had finally erupted, and there was no containing the flood. His hands shook as he wiped his eyes, aware that these men, who'd trusted him with their families' lives, were witnessing the collapse of everything they believed about their community's greatest treasure. Sheriff Torres approached the bed, his lawman's instincts sensing that something far more serious than a mining accident was unfolding in the small clinic. "Martha? Can you hear me? What happened here?" But Martha Clearwater was beyond answering earthly questions. Her final breath escaped her lips like a whisper of wind through autumn leaves, taking with it the secret she'd carried across 3 states and 30 years. The silence that followed felt heavy with implication, broken only by the sound of Morrison's ragged breathing and the persistent Montana wind that seemed to mock the drama playing out in the humble clinic. Reverend Mitchell moved to close Martha's eyes, his gentle touch a stark contrast to the storm of revelation that had just torn through the room. "She knew me," Morrison said finally, his voice barely recognizable. "She knew who I really was. Who I was before I came here." The 3 men exchanged glances, sensing that their respected doctor was about to confess something that would change everything they thought they knew about him. Outside, the sound of approaching footsteps indicated that word of Martha's death was spreading, and soon the entire town would be gathered at the clinic, expecting their beloved doctor to comfort them in their loss. But Henry Morrison, or Henry Blackwell, as Martha had called him, was about to discover that some confessions can't be contained, and some secrets, once spoken, can never be buried again. Morrison stood in the center of his clinic, surrounded by the men who'd become his closest friends over 3 decades, and felt the weight of his double life crushing down on him like a mine collapse. The clock on the wall ticked with metronomic precision, each second bringing him closer to a decision that would either damn him or finally set him free. Through the frosted windows, he could see lantern light bobbing as more townspeople approached, drawn by the news of Martha's death and the strange sounds of distress coming from their doctor's clinic. "There's something I need to tell you," Morrison began, then stopped, the words catching in his throat like broken glass. His medical diploma hung on the wall behind him, bearing the name Henry Blackwell in faded ink, a daily reminder of the man he'd tried to forget. The familiar weight of his stethoscope around his neck felt suddenly foreign, as if it belonged to someone else, someone worthy of wearing it. Sheriff Torres stepped closer, his hand instinctively moving toward his badge, the lawman in him sensing that a confession was coming that might require official action. The sound of voices outside grew louder as more residents gathered, their concern for Martha mixing with worry for the doctor who'd seemed so strangely affected by her death. Morrison could hear Mrs. Patterson asking if Doc Morrison was all right, could hear young Billy Sullivan wondering why there was crying coming from the clinic. These were people he'd helped bring into the world, people whose children he'd saved from scarlet fever and whose grandparents he'd eased into peaceful deaths. They trusted him completely, and that trust was about to be shattered by the revelation of who he really was. 30 years ago, I was a different man, Morrison said, his voice growing stronger with each word. I lived in Philadelphia and I made a choice that cost a child his life. A little boy named Timothy Kellison died because I refused to treat him. Because his family couldn't pay my fee. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Mayor Jackson's sharp intake of breath and the distant murmur of the growing crowd outside. Morrison looked at each man in turn, seeing their expressions shift from concern to confusion to something that might have been disappointment or might have been understanding. But the hardest part of his confession was still to come, and Henry Morrison realized that the next words out of his mouth would determine whether he spent his remaining years as a respected member of the community or as a pariah haunted by the ghost of Timothy Kellison. Reverend Mitchell was the first to speak, his voice gentle but probing. "Henry, we've all made mistakes in our past. What matters is the man you've become here in Copper Falls." But Morrison shook his head, knowing that the Reverend's words, though kind, couldn't absolve him of the magnitude of his sin. The smell of melting candle wax from Martha's bedside vigil mixed with the cold air seeping through the clinic walls, creating an atmosphere of funeral solemnity that seemed appropriate for the death of his carefully constructed identity. "You don't understand," Morrison said, his voice gaining the steady rhythm of a man finally ready to tell the complete truth. "Timothy Kellison wasn't just another patient I turned away. He was my nephew." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow, causing Sheriff Torres to step backward and Mayor Jackson to grip the back of a chair for support. The wind outside seemed to pause, as if even nature was holding its breath to hear the rest of Morrison's confession. "My sister Mary had married an Irish immigrant named Patrick Kellison. I disapproved of the match, thought she was marrying beneath her station. When she brought Timothy to me that night, she was Martha's mother. She was my own flesh and blood, begging me to save her son." Morrison's voice cracked as the full horror of his betrayal became clear. He hadn't just refused to treat a poor child, he turned away his own sister and let his nephew die rather than acknowledge his connection to a family he considered beneath his social standing. The sound of his sister's voice echoed across 30 years, her Irish accent thickened by desperation as she'd pleaded with him, "Henry, please, he's burning up. He's your nephew, your blood." But young Dr. Henry Blackwell had been too proud, too concerned with his reputation among Philadelphia's elite to be seen treating Irish immigrants, even if they were family. The memory of Timothy's fevered face haunted him still, blue eyes so much like his own, small hands reaching out for an uncle who'd turned his back rather than risk his precious social standing. "After Timothy died, Mary never spoke to me again," Morrison continued, tears flowing freely now. "She changed her name to Clearwater and moved west with Martha. I lost my practice, my reputation, everything when the story got out. So I came here, changed my name, and swore I'd never again let pride or money stand between me and saving a life." As the full scope of his 30-year penance became clear, The men in the clinic began to understand that their beloved doctor's generosity hadn't been saintliness, it had been an endless attempt to atone for the most unforgivable sin a healer could commit, letting family die to protect his own vanity. The clinic door opened again, and this time it was Mrs. Patterson, the schoolteacher, followed by half a dozen other concerned townspeople. "Doc Morrison, we heard crying and wanted to make sure everything was—" Her voice trailed off as she took in the scene. Martha's still form on the bed, their beloved doctor with tears streaming down his face, and the grim expressions of the town's leadership. The smell of wood smoke from the gathering crowd's torches mixed with the clinical atmosphere, creating a scene that felt more like a medieval inquisition than a modern medical crisis. Sheriff Torres faced an impossible situation. The man who'd saved his daughter's life during the diphtheria outbreak, who'd delivered his son and tended his wife through difficult labor, had just confessed to letting a child die out of pure vanity and pride. The badge on his chest felt heavy as lead, a reminder of his duty to uphold justice even when it meant arresting the most beloved man in Copper Falls. "Henry," he said quietly, "I need to know, is there more? Are there other deaths, other patients you turned away?" Morrison shook his head emphatically. "Only Timothy. Only my nephew. Everything I've done since then, every life I've saved without charge, it's all been trying to balance the scale somehow." But the crowd in the doorway was growing restless, sensing that their doctor was in some kind of crisis but unable to understand the magnitude of what was being revealed. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd taught 3 generations of Copper Falls children. "Dr. Morrison has saved more lives than anyone in this territory. Whatever's troubling you, we'll face it together." But Morrison knew that community loyalty, no matter how strong, couldn't survive the complete truth. These people had trusted him with their most precious possessions, their children, their parents, their own lives. How could he explain that their saint had once been a man so consumed by social pretension that he'd let his own nephew die rather than acknowledge a connection to Irish immigrants? The sound of more voices outside indicated that word was spreading faster than wildfire, and soon the entire town would be demanding answers he wasn't sure they could handle. As if summoned by his worst fears, a new voice cut through the crowd. Old Patrick Kellison himself, Martha's father, who'd followed his daughter to Copper Falls and had been waiting outside the clinic since word of the mining accident spread. "Is she?" he began, then stopped as his eyes fell on Morrison's face. 30 years melted away in an instant, and Patrick's weathered features transformed with recognition and rage. "Holy Mother of God," he whispered in his still thick Irish brogue. "Henry Blackwell. The doctor who killed my grandson." The crowd's murmur rose to a confused buzz as Patrick pushed through them, his gnarled hands clenched into fists that trembled with 3 decades of suppressed fury. The confrontation erupted like a dam bursting. Patrick Kellison lunged at Morrison with surprising speed for a man in his 70s, his fists connecting with the doctor's chest before Sheriff Torres could intervene. "Murderer!" Patrick screamed, his Irish accent thick with grief and rage. "You killed my Timothy. My Mary died of a broken heart, and you've been playing saint while my family rotted in their graves." The sound of struggle filled the clinic as Torres and Mayor Jackson pulled the old man back, but his words had already done their damage. The crowd outside exploded into chaos. 30 years of gratitude and respect collided with the revelation that their beloved doctor had once been capable of such callous cruelty. Some voices rose in Morrison's defense, Mrs. Patterson insisting that the man who'd saved her son from pneumonia couldn't be capable of letting a child die. Others joined Patrick's accusations, suddenly remembering times when Morrison had seemed distant or haunted, interpreting his mysterious past as evidence of hidden evil. The smell of fear, sweat, and anger filled the small clinic as the community Morrison had served so faithfully began to tear itself apart. Sheriff Torres managed to restore a semblance of order, his voice booming over the chaos. "Everyone calm down. We'll get to the truth of this, but not like a lynch mob." But the damage was done. The secret Morrison had carried for 30 years was now public knowledge, and Copper Falls would never be the same. Some families began demanding that he re-examine their loved ones who died under his care, suddenly suspicious that the man they trusted might have been harboring murderous intent all along. Morrison stood in the center of the storm, no longer trying to defend himself. The weight of Timothy's death, carried alone for 3 decades, had finally been shared with the world, and the relief was almost as overwhelming as the shame. "I understand if you want me to leave," he said quietly, his words somehow carrying over the din. "I understand if you can never forgive me. But I want you to know that every patient I've treated, every life I've saved, has been my attempt to honor Timothy's memory." But Patrick Kellison wasn't finished. His old eyes burned with the fire of long-delayed justice as he pulled something from his coat pocket, a daguerreotype, faded and cracked with age. "This was my Timothy," he said, holding up the photograph for everyone to see. The image showed a beautiful child with dark hair and bright eyes, a boy who would have grown up to have children of his own if not for his uncle's pride. As the crowd looked at the picture, then at Morrison's face, something unexpected began to happen, and it would change everything one final time. As Patrick held up Timothy's photograph, gasps rippled through the crowd. The resemblance between the dead child and Dr. Morrison was unmistakable, the same deep blue eyes, the same stubborn jaw, the same gentle mouth that had spoken comfort to countless patients over the years. But more shocking than the family resemblance was what Mrs. Patterson suddenly realized as she stared at the old daguerreotype. "Dear God," she whispered, her voice cutting through the crowd's murmur. "Butter, the child. He looks exactly like young Billy Thompson." The crowd turned as one to look at 10-year-old Billy Thompson, who stood with his mother near the clinic door. The boy's resemblance to the photograph was startling, but what made the moment truly extraordinary was the story everyone in Copper Falls knew by heart, how Dr. Morrison had fought for 3 straight days to save Billy from the same fever that had killed children throughout the territory. How he'd refused to leave the boy's bedside, trying experimental treatments that other doctors wouldn't risk, spending his own money on medicines that might not work. Billy's mother, Sarah Thompson, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "Dr. Morrison," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "you saved my Billy when everyone else said it was hopeless. You've saved dozens of children from the same fever that took your nephew." The crowd began to understand the profound symmetry of Morrison's 30-year mission. He hadn't just been treating patients, he'd been saving Timothy Kellison over and over again in every child he refused to let die. Patrick Kellison's anger faltered as he looked around the clinic at the living testament to Morrison's redemption. The shelves lined with medicines the doctor had purchased with his own money, the special cots he'd had made for children too small for adult beds, the toys he kept to comfort frightened patients. Everything spoke of a man who'd dedicated his life to ensuring that no other family would suffer as the Kellisons had suffered. Old Patrick's weathered hand trembled as he touched Timothy's photograph one final time. 30 years, he whispered, his Irish accent soft with wonder rather than rage. 30 years you've been saving my Timothy in every child you've treated." The realization hit the crowd like a revelation. Their doctor hadn't been hiding from his sin, he'd been transforming it into something sacred. Every free treatment, every midnight house call, every refusal to accept payment had been an act of resurrection, bringing Timothy Kellison back to life in the children of Copper Falls who lived because Henry Morrison had learned the true cost of mercy. The silence in the clinic stretched like a held breath as Patrick Kellison walked slowly toward the man who'd killed his grandson and spent 30 years bringing him back to life. Morrison stood perfectly still, tears streaming down his face, making no move to defend himself or flee from whatever judgment was coming. The sound of wind through the clinic walls seemed to carry voices from the past, Timothy's fevered cries, Mary's desperate pleas, and the whispered prayers that had followed Morrison across half a continent. Patrick stopped directly in front of Morrison, the daguerreotype still clutched in his gnarled hands. For a moment that felt like eternity, the two men stared at each other, the grieving grandfather and the penitent uncle, separated by 30 years of pain but connected by the blood that had been spilled and the lives that had been saved. The crowd held its collective breath, unsure whether they were about to witness reconciliation or revenge. "You were a proud, foolish young man," Patrick said finally, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the hushed clinic. "You let my Timothy die because you were ashamed of your Irish blood, ashamed of the family that loved you." Morrison nodded, unable to speak, his shoulders shaking with the weight of guilt that had defined his entire adult life. The old man's words cut deeper than any physical blow, stripping away the last of Morrison's defenses and leaving him naked before the judgment he'd been running from since 1857. But then Patrick did something that shocked everyone in the room. He reached out and took Morrison's trembling hands in his own, pressing Timothy's photograph between their palms. "But you've spent 30 years making sure no other child dies as my Timothy died. You've carried my grandson's memory in every patient you've saved, and that takes a different kind of courage than the pride that killed him." The moment stretched between them like a bridge spanning 30 years of grief and guilt. Morrison felt Timothy's presence in that small clinic, not as an accusation but as an absolution, carried in the living breath of every child he'd refused to let slip away into darkness. When Patrick Kellison finally spoke again, his words would either damn Henry Morrison forever or grant him the forgiveness he'd never dared hope to receive. "Can you forgive an old man his anger, Dr. Morrison? And can you finally forgive yourself?" The embrace between Patrick Kellison and Henry Morrison broke the dam of 30 years of grief, guilt, and suppressed sorrow. The old grandfather and the penitent doctor wept together in the center of the clinic, their tears washing away 3 decades of pain and transforming tragedy into something approaching grace. The crowd watched in awed silence as 2 men who should have been enemies found peace in their shared love for a child who died